In 1908, a young reporter walked into the office of the richest man in the world and asked him one question. That question, and the 20-year investigation it triggered, would eventually be distilled into 13 principles. Those principles built the fortunes of Ford, Carnegie, Edison, and Rockefeller. They've been credited by more self-made millionaires than any other book in history. The book is called Think and Grow Rich, and in the next 50 minutes, I'm going to walk you through every single principle inside it. Not the watered-down version you see in Sura 10-minute recap videos, but the real mechanics, the stuff that actually explains why most people stay broke, and why a small percentage of people don't. Stay until the end, because principle number 11 is the one almost nobody talks about, and it's arguably the strangest one in the entire book. Let's get into it. Before we get to the principles, you need the backstory, because it changes how you'll hear everything else. That young reporter was Napoleon Hill. The richest man was Andrew Carnegie, steel magnate, one of the wealthiest human beings who has ever lived. Carnegie didn't just answer Hill's question. He made him an offer. Spend the next 2 decades of your life interviewing the most successful people in America, and the ones who failed spectacularly too, and find the common thread. Carnegie wouldn't pay him a salary. He'd only give him letters of introduction to men like Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, John D. Rockefeller, and Alexander Graham Bell. Hill said yes. 20 years, over 500 interviews, and countless case studies of failure and success later, he published this book in 1937, deep in the Great Depression, when roughly a quarter of America was unemployed and the entire country was convinced that money and security were gone for good. That context matters. This isn't a book written during boom times by someone who got lucky. It's a book written when everyone around the author was failing, arguing that failure has almost nothing to do with the economy and almost everything to do with what's happening inside a person's head. Hill's core claim, the one the whole book is built on, is deceptively simple. Thoughts are things, not in a mystical wish it into existence way. We'll get into how literal or metaphorical to take that, but in the sense that every fortune, every invention, every business empire started as a single thought in someone's mind before it existed anywhere else. The question the book answers is, what has to happen to that thought before it becomes a bank account? 13 things, according to Hill. Let's go through them one at a time. The first principle isn't motivation. It isn't hustle. It's desire, but a very specific, almost obsessive kind of desire that Hill calls a burning desire. Here's the distinction that matters. Most people have a wish. They wish they had more money. They wish they had a better career. A wish is passive. It sits there and waits for circumstances to change. A burning desire is active. It's the difference between someone who says, "I'd like to lose weight," and someone training for a fight 3 months out, who has already picked the date they step in the ring. Hill illustrates this with the story of Edwin Barnes, a man who wanted to work directly with Thomas Edison. Not for Edison, with him as a business partner. Barnes had no money for train fare. He had no formal education. He had no connections. What he had was a decision so specific and so absolute that he showed up at Edison's laboratory in dirty, rumpled clothes and essentially refused to leave until he got a foot in the door. Edison later said Barnes looked like an ordinary tramp, but there was something in his expression that suggested he had already decided what he was going to get. And that decision was more convincing than any resume could have been. It took years. Barnes started as basically an errand runner, but he stayed close. And when Edison invented the dictating machine, a device none of Edison's own salespeople believed in, Barnes was the one person positioned to say, "Let me sell that." He became Edison's exclusive distribution partner. Hill breaks the process of turning desire into money into 6 concrete steps. And this is the part most people skip because it sounds almost too simple to work. First, decide the exact amount of money you want. Not a lot, but a number. Second, decide exactly what you intend to give in return for it, because Hill is blunt that nothing worth having comes without a fair exchange. Third, set a definite date for when you intend to have it. Fourth, create a specific plan and start immediately, ready or not. Fifth, write all of this down in one clear statement. Sixth, read that statement aloud twice a day, once when you wake up, once before bed, while genuinely feeling as if you already have the money. That last step is where a lot of people roll their eyes. And we'll come back to why Hill insisted on it when we get to the principle on autosuggestion. But the broader point of this whole chapter is that vague desire produces vague results, and specific burning desire is the entry fee for everything else in the book. Nothing after this works without it. The second principle is faith, and Hill defines it in a very particular way. Not religious faith, though he draws heavily on religious language to describe it. He means a state of mind, one that can apparently be deliberately induced through repetition, that convinces the subconscious mind something is achievable. The most useful part of this chapter isn't the philosophy, it's the mechanism Hill proposes. Faith is a state you can build, the same way you build a habit, through repeated self-instruction. He argues that whatever the conscious mind repeats to itself with real emotion, the subconscious eventually accepts as instruction and acts on, whether the thing repeated is true or false. This is where Hill tells you something slightly uncomfortable. Your current level of confidence, or lack of it, isn't fixed personality. It's the result of years of unconscious repetition, most of it negative, most of it absorbed from other people. Every time you told yourself, "I'm not good with money," or "people like me don't get opportunities like that," you were running the exact same mechanism Hill wants you to use deliberately, just pointed in the wrong direction. He also spends real time on the flip side, fear. Faith and fear, in Hill's model, are the same mechanism aimed at opposite outcomes. Fear is faith in failure. And because both operate through the same subconscious channel, you cannot hold genuine faith in success while simultaneously marinating in fear of failure. One will always dominate. This sets up the entire back half of the book, because Hill later devotes an entire chapter to naming and dismantling the 6 specific fears he found repeatedly sabotaging the people he studied. Principle 3, autosuggestion, is the delivery mechanism for Principle 2. If faith is the state you want to build, autosuggestion is literally how you build it. Hill's argument is that the subconscious mind doesn't distinguish well between a vividly imagined scenario and a real one. It responds to whichever thought is delivered with the most emotional intensity and repetition, regardless of whether it originated from real experience or from something you deliberately imagined. This is why he was so insistent, back in the desire chapter, that you read your written goal aloud twice daily, while feeling the emotion of already possessing it. Reading a goal flatly, like a grocery list, does nothing according to Hill's model. The emotional charge is the ingredient that actually gets the message through to the subconscious. He's also careful to note that this cuts both ways, and this is arguably the most practically useful idea in the whole chapter. If you're not deliberately feeding your mind constructive thoughts, you're not left in neutral. Your environment, the news, the complaints of coworkers, casual negativity from family, is feeding it something by default, and that something accumulates the exact same way positive repetition does. Autosuggestion isn't a technique you can opt out of. You're always practicing it. The only choice is whether you're doing it on purpose. Here's where Hill makes a distinction that surprises a lot of people. He explicitly says, general knowledge does not attract money. A person can be broadly, classically educated and still be broke, while someone with almost no formal schooling can become wealthy through specialized knowledge applied toward a specific goal. He's blunt about this because in the 1930s, formal education was treated as almost sacred, and Hill wanted to knock that assumption down. He points to Henry Ford, who was famously mocked in a lawsuit for not knowing certain historical trivia, and had a lawyer read him a list of ignorant man questions on a witness stand. Ford's response, paraphrased, was that he had a row of buttons on his office desk, and by pressing the right one he could summon an expert who could answer any question the lawyer wanted to ask. So why would he clutter his own mind with facts he could access on demand? The point wasn't that knowledge doesn't matter. The point was that knowing where to get knowledge and knowing how to organize it toward a goal matters more than accumulating it yourself. This chapter also contains one of Hill's more practical, almost mundane pieces of advice. Knowledge only becomes power once it's organized and directed at a definite end through a practical plan. Raw information sitting in your head, disconnected from any goal, is not an asset. It's just trivia. This is why he recommended people identify exactly what specialized knowledge says their specific goal required, then go get precisely that through courses, mentors, or hands-on experience rather than assuming more education in general would eventually pay off. Principle 5 is imagination, and Hill splits it into two types. Synthetic imagination takes existing ideas, facts, or inventions and rearranges them into new combinations. Creative imagination, which Hill treats as rarer and closer to intuition, is where genuinely new ideas seem to arrive from. Hunches, flashes of insight, the thing people call inspiration. Most successful business ideas, in Hill's analysis, come from synthetic imagination, not inventing something from nothing, but noticing that two existing things, combined, solve a problem neither solved alone. He uses the example of how a soft drink and a coca leaf extract or a mundane household product were combined in unexpected ways to build fortunes. The raw materials already existed. The fortune came from the combination. He argues imagination atrophies like a muscle if it isn't used, largely because formal schooling and routine work train people to follow instructions rather than generate new combinations. And he makes an important, less obvious point. Imagination isn't just for artists or inventors. It's required to translate the abstract, burning desire from Principle 1 into an actual concrete plan, which is exactly the subject of the next principle. This is the longest, most mechanically detailed chapter in the book, because it's where desire and imagination actually get converted into a working strategy. Hill's first major point here is uncomfortable but important. A good plan will almost never survive contact with reality on the first attempt, and that's not evidence of personal failure. It's the normal cost of doing something that hasn't been done exactly that way before. He tells people, in essence, plan to revise the plan. What separates people who eventually succeed from people who quit isn't that the successful ones got it right the first time. It's that they treated the first failed plan as data, built a second one, and kept going. He also tackles alliance building here, foreshadowing the mastermind principle later on. Almost nobody achieves major financial success purely alone, so the planning chapter includes instructions on choosing capable allies, compensating them fairly. Hill is very clear that expecting people's best work without fair compensation is both unethical and strategically foolish, and organizing group effort toward the specific goal defined back in Principle 1. There's also a section here on leadership versus what Hill calls the traits of failed leadership. And it reads almost like a checklist of red flags. Leading through fear rather than earned respect, inconsistency, avoiding accountability, taking credit that belongs to the team. It's dry compared to the rest of the book, but it's some of the most directly actionable material in the whole thing if you're building anything with other people involved. Short chapter, sharp point. Hill found that the successful people he studied made decisions quickly and rarely reversed them, while the people who never accumulated wealth made decisions slowly, if at all, and reversed them constantly. His theory for why is almost sociological. He argues most people are highly susceptible to the opinions of others, friends, family, strangers on the internet in today's terms, and that other people's opinions is one of the most common ways a person's own desire gets talked out of them before it has a chance to become anything. His advice, somewhat controversially, is to keep your major goals and plans to a very small, trusted circle, precisely because most unsolicited opinions are negative, low effort, and come from people who haven't achieved what you're trying to achieve. He also connects indecision directly back to fear, specifically the fear of criticism, which he later names as one of the 6 basic fears. Indecisiveness, in his model, isn't really about lacking information. It's usually fear wearing a disguise. If desire is the fuel, Hill treats persistence as the engine that has to keep running, long after the initial motivation fades. And he's very clear that motivation always fades. Persistence is what's left when the initial excitement is gone and the work is just work. He identifies specific recognizable symptoms of a lack of persistence: failing to define exactly what you want, procrastination dressed up as waiting for the right time, relying on excuses instead of plans, and, this one lands hardest, the habit of quitting at the first sign of real difficulty, rather than treating difficulty as the expected cost of doing something worthwhile. The chapter includes what's practically a self-diagnostic checklist, and Hill also gives concrete steps for building persistence deliberately, rather than treating it as a fixed trait some people have and others don't. A definite purpose backed by burning desire, a definite plan carried out in continuous action, a mind closed off from discouraging influences from friends and relatives, and a friendly alliance with people who encourage the plan rather than criticize it. Notice how many of the earlier principles feed directly back into this one. That's intentional. Hill designed the 13 principles to reinforce each other, not stand alone. Here's a principle most modern summaries skip past too quickly, but it's one of Hill's more genuinely original contributions. Hill defines the mastermind as a coordination of knowledge and effort between two or more people, working toward a definite purpose in a spirit of harmony, and he argues something almost mystical follows from this arrangement. The combined group generates a level of mental energy and problem-solving capacity that exceeds what any individual member could produce alone, as if the alliance itself creates a kind of collective intelligence. Whether or not you take the extra energy claim literally, the practical case underneath it holds up. Hill points to Henry Ford's meteoric rise coinciding almost exactly with his alliance with Edison, Firestone, and Edsel Ford, a circle of people who each brought something the others lacked. He argues no fortune of real size in his 500-plus interviews was built by someone working in total isolation. Every one of them had a mastermind group, whether they called it that or not. Partners, advisors, or allies whose combined thinking outperformed any one person's. The catch, and Hill is specific about this, is the word harmony. A group that's outwardly cooperating but privately resentful, competitive, or misaligned doesn't get the benefit. The alliance has to be built on genuine mutual benefit, not one person extracting value from the others. Okay, this is the one I promised you at the top, and it's the chapter people either skip entirely or completely misread. Hill's argument, stripped of the 1930s language, is essentially this. Sexual desire is, in his estimation, the single most powerful driving emotion available to a human being, more intense and more motivating than almost any other force he cataloged across his 500 interviews. His claim isn't about suppressing that energy, it's the opposite. He argues that this same emotional and creative intensity can be deliberately redirected, transmuted is his word, from a purely physical outlet into creative work, ambition, art, or business drive. He backs this up by pointing out something he found repeatedly in his research. An unusually large number of the highly successful men he studied did their most creative, most ambitious work during periods of their lives defined by strong romantic or sexual motivation, often, specifically, while trying to impress, provide for, or win the admiration of a particular woman. Hill's theory is that the emotional intensity didn't disappear. It got rerouted into the business or creative project instead. He's also careful, and this part is easy to miss if you're skimming, to connect it to persistence and imagination directly. He argues this transmuted energy is what gives otherwise ordinary plans an unusual amount of drive and creative spark behind them. The difference between a plan pursued with mild interest and one pursued with something closer to obsession. It's the strangest chapter in the book by modern standards, but Hill treated it completely seriously, and it's one of the few chapters where he explicitly says, most people never learn to use this principle deliberately at all. This chapter functions almost like a summary of the mechanism running underneath everything so far. Hill argues the subconscious mind acts as a kind of connecting link between conscious thought and what he calls infinite intelligence. And regardless of how literally you take that phrase, his practical claim is narrower and more useful. The subconscious will act on whatever emotionalized thought is fed to it repeatedly, whether that thought is deliberately planted through the earlier techniques or absorbed passively from a negative environment. This is essentially the payoff chapter for autosuggestion. It's short because Hill has already explained the mechanism. This chapter is mostly reinforcing that the input has to be positive, specific, and emotionally charged because the subconscious, in his model, doesn't filter for whether a repeated thought is helpful or harmful. It just acts on what it's given most consistently. A brief chapter, and honestly the most dated one scientifically, where Hill describes the brain as something like a broadcasting and receiving station for thought, proposing that intense, emotionalized thinking can somehow be picked up by other minds operating on a similar wavelength. Even setting the literal biology aside, there's a practical observation underneath it that holds up regardless. People who are deeply focused and emotionally invested in an idea tend to notice relevant opportunities, information, and people connected to that idea far more often than people who aren't focused on anything in particular. Not because those opportunities are being transmitted to them, but because focused attention changes what a person notices in a chaotic, opportunity-dense environment. Whether you buy Hill's radio wave metaphor or not, the behavioral pattern he's describing is real the final principle, and Hill openly admits this one will sound implausible to a skeptical reader. He describes the sixth sense as a kind of accumulated wisdom or intuition that only becomes available after a person has genuinely internalized all 12 previous principles. Not a shortcut you can access on day one, but something Hill claims emerges after years of disciplined practice of everything that came before it. He's honest that this chapter is the hardest to teach directly, and frames it less as a technique and more as a description of what mastery of the other 12 principles eventually feels like from the inside. A kind of trained intuition that lets a person sense the right decision or the right opportunity faster than they could consciously reason their way to it. Before the book closes, Hill circles back to the enemy that's been lurking under every chapter: fear. He identifies 6 specific fears he found sabotaging people again and again across his interviews: the fear of poverty, the fear of criticism, the fear of ill health, the fear of loss of love, the fear of old age, and the fear of death. Of these, he argues the fear of poverty is the most destructive and the most common, partly because it's the one most reinforced by everyday conversation. People casually, constantly talk themselves and each other into scarcity thinking, without ever noticing they're doing it. And the fear of criticism is a close second, because it's the one most responsible for killing ideas before they're ever attempted. Most people, in Hill's observation, would rather never try something than risk being laughed at for trying and failing. His prescription isn't complicated, even if it's hard to execute: awareness. He argues most of these fears operate below conscious notice, quietly shaping decisions a person believes are purely rational. The moment you can name which fear is actually driving a hesitation, is this really a bad plan? Or am I just afraid of what people will say? You've already taken most of its power away. So that's all 13 principles, plus the fears that undermine them, distilled from 20 years and over 500 interviews with the most successful and some of the most spectacularly unsuccessful people of Hill's era. If you strip away the 1930s language, the core argument holds up almost a century later. Success isn't random, and it isn't purely about circumstances. It's a sequence: burning desire, backed by faith, delivered through repetition, aimed by specific knowledge, shaped by imagination, organized into a plan, locked in by fast decisions, carried by persistence, multiplied through the right alliances, and driven by more emotional intensity than most people ever give themselves permission to use. If this breakdown was useful, let me know in the comments which principle hit hardest for you. And subscribe, because next week I'm breaking down the book that this one directly inspired.